our next panel, Eliminating Hidden Bias in Autonomy and Beyond. This panel is sponsored by Women in Autonomy. Our moderator is Genevieve Smith from the Berkeley Haas Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership. Genevieve is the director of the center, and they execute strategy to advance equity and inclusion in the industry. The current area of focus is mitigating bias in artificial intelligence in actions for business leaders. For a decade, Genevieve's conducted research and advised Fortune 500 companies on gender equity, women's economic empowerment, and inclusive technology. We also have with us Dr. Neda Cvijetic. Neda is responsible for product management and product marketing for autonomous vehicles at NVIDIA. She's also the producer and host of Drive Labs, a video and blog series that provides a behind-the-scenes look at a range of AI and AV technologies under development at NVIDIA. Dr. Cvijetic holds a PhD in electrical engineering from the University of Virginia and is the author of more than 20 granted US patents. Next, we have Neda Miguel. Neda leads vehicle experience platforms for autonomous driving at Aptiv. Prior to joining Aptiv, Neda led design for new ground combat vehicles and field robots in affiliation with the Army Research Lab in the Department of the Defense. And Dr. Sarah Thornton is the autonomous systems engineer for Nuro. Dr. Thornton received her PhD in mechanical engineering at Stanford University, where her thesis was on the signing autonomous vehicle motion planning algorithms with ethical considerations. She holds a bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the University of California, Berkeley, and a master's in mechanical engineering from MIT. I'll turn this panel over to you, Genevieve.
Great, thank you. And I wish I had the nice background. I'm still on a computer that does not have the processing power for backgrounds, which is, unfortunate in this virtual world. But anyways, I'm loving the background from the rest of the panelists. Well, to kick us off, it's wonderful to speak with this incredible group of talented women on the front lines of developing and working on systems for automated and autonomous vehicles. And to get us started, I'm curious, for each of our panelists, what interested you in the space of bias in artificial intelligence and automation? Maybe we can start with you, Sarah.
Sure, thanks. First of all, I'd like to thank Velodyne and Women in Autonomy for having me on this panel. It's great to be here and talk with all you ladies on such a great topic. So what drew me to this space, I think, frankly, came with a natural fallout from my PhD work on autonomous vehicle motion planning with ethical considerations. My background is actually in controls and automation, and this work, that PhD, allowed me to work really closely with philosophers and lawyers and try to bring in their expertise into how we design algorithms. And so when it came to designing an autonomous vehicle to behave ethically, I came to realize that ethical behavior wasn't just a controls problem. It requires the whole system to come together to realize that goal. And it also requires bringing in some philosophical questioning. What sensors are you using? What data are you using? What human values are you actually capturing in your system and behavior? Is the algorithm that you're implementing going to help you realize these human values? And so those are types of things that get me really excited about this topic, and excited to talk more with you ladies.
I love that. Fascinating. Thanks for sharing. Nandita or Neda? Nandita, go ahead. I see you're unmuted.
Okay. Yeah, so I actually started my career in the defense space, and always was very interested in the human-centered systems piece, where we're not designing just systems for system's sake, right? We're designing systems for human use, for human usage and human benefit. And so from that perspective, when I was working in the defense sector, it struck me that we're not just designing for human-centered artificial intelligence systems or complex systems which are human-centered, and that doesn't mean just being inclusive of all human needs, but also being very mindful of what it really means to include certain demographics or include certain needs of certain groups of teams, for example. So that's where I kind of said, okay, it's not just good enough to be human-centered. You also have to think more clearly about what are the needs of this special demographic or this special data set, and why we have to spend more time, deliberate time, in making sure we understand their needs when we're designing our system.
Great, fantastic. Neda, over to you.
Yes, so for me, it was getting involved with reinforcement learning and deep reinforcement learning areas of AI, which basically works by teaching an agent to do something in a virtual or simulated environment, like teaching a robot to play hockey, teaching a car to do motion planning, for example. And that's done essentially by giving credits or rewards to that agent when they do something. And so what can happen there is that that agent can learn very unintended ways of doing things without ever actually reaching the goal that you were implicitly thinking you're working towards. And those consequences can be either silly or they can be full on unethical. And seeing that, I think, kind of creeps you out. And I bet that Sarah had maybe some of this experience, during her graduate work as well. And so for me, that was really the trigger point, because you realize that the credits and reward system was biased, unintentionally, but it was, and you see that by the outcome.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's great to hear kind of the backgrounds that has brought each of you to this space. And I'm excited to dig in more to some of the points that you each brought up. And maybe Nandita, we can start with you. And, I'm curious, just to kind of set us up, how do data gaps contribute to bias in the automotive industry? Let's just start there. And could you share an example?
Yeah, sure thing. So just to clarify, a data gap is essentially the root of the problem in many times when we have bias. And when we mean data gap is the lack of data when we're designing a system, when we're designing a model for learning. And a good example of that in automotive would happen when we forget to include certain data sets of certain representative of demographics or certain groups of people, for example. And a data gap that has happened while it might think that automotive, we wouldn't have ever such a thing, a very surprising event that did happen was, for example, only in 2003 did the female crash dummy actually got included by NHTSA in automotive studies. So as you can imagine, all this while, we were actually using male crash dummies to understand the impact of crash, whiplash impact on the body. And as you can imagine, that has huge consequences on the crash vehicles. So a very simple example of forgetting to include a major portion of your population in your studies actually happened in automotive. And I think in NHTSA, they actually say that after 2010 is the crash ratings that you should actually refer to because of this forgetting to include the female crash dummy. So you can see that it's actually has big consequences to forgetting to include a very important demographic. And as far as AI is concerned, we have to keep that in mind because when we're talking inside the cabin, autonomous vehicles are going to be very complex, monitoring a lot of our cabin. So that is something that we have to apply. That data gap doesn't exist inside the cabin as well.
Yeah, those are really good points. I think the data gap, or the point you bring up too around kind of crash test dummies, that's it's such an obvious one when you think about it, like how have women's bodies not been considered within crash test dummies, right? And it does have really real impacts and results in people's lives. And thinking about AI systems as well, another kind of data gap that we've noticed is around kind of even like voice recognition systems in cars, that can be less accurate for women. And again, that kind of goes back to who's represented or who's over underrepresented and training data sets and things like that. So all really good points. Thanks for sharing. So Sarah, moving over to you and kind of related to what we were talking about. So there's a research study on self-driving vehicles that was conducted in 2019 from the Georgia Institute of Technology that found that detection of dark-skinned people was 5 percentage points less accurate than light-skinned people. How does this type of bias in the outcomes of an AI system for autonomous vehicles manifest? Maybe you can just kind of connect to some of the points, excuse me, we've been talking about and share any other thoughts that you have.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I think firstly, I'd like to point out that, I guess already kind of like Nandita already pointed out as well, the bias in technology is not new. There are other studies that show similarly, like automatic hand washing stations often have the infrared sensors calibrated mainly for light skin complexion. And so those with darker skin complexion have difficulties using, just washing their hands. At airports, the body scanning machines require operators to select male or female. And so that actually biases then against transgender and who may fall into potentially both of those buckets. And so what's important about having this conversation now is that these biases are potentially still going to be embedded in these technologies unconsciously or consciously. But with AI, it's now potentially being captured at an unprecedented scale. And so the implications are that these seemingly small design decisions are now getting manifested in kind of becoming this policy because they're now being deployed at scale. And so when it comes to autonomous vehicles and these sorts of biases, such as the Georgia Tech study highlights, that can also manifest behaviorally in an autonomous vehicle system. By that I mean, it shows with the lower detection accuracy means there's potentially a higher likelihood of not detecting those people at all, or maybe the best case of the lower likelihood is a delayed reaction by the autonomous vehicle to avoid close encounters. And by that, I mean the vehicle may not decelerate or steer away enough from that person because they have a darker skin complexion. And that means that the vehicle is going to get a lot closer and potentially be at a higher speed, which means higher collision severity for those with darker skin compared to those with lighter skin. And that's terrible. So we need to make sure, one, be aware of this and try to intentionally design against that.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of related to that, what do you think is needed to both identify and tackle biases within data sets and algorithms and ultimately, these AI systems? What are some thoughts that you have around some of those solutions?
Yeah, thanks. I think it largely comes down to company culture and the human values that you want your product to represent. And so I argue that by being explicit about the human values that you're capturing in your product, that will then encourage your team, your company, your engineers to tackle these biases, because it's not just an implicit thing, it's an explicit thing in your company and what you're trying to capture in your product. And so there's techniques, something I tried to modify in my PhD was this value sensitive design methodology. And that puts the human values of your product at the front and center and puts that kind of like as the goalpost for what you're trying to design for in your product.
That's fascinating. I wonder if you could just share maybe a little bit more around that. How do you put the human values as the goalpost? Like, what does that kind of look like in practice? If you could just share a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So value sensitive design is a very generic design methodology. It entails iterating over around 3 phases. The first is this conceptualization phase, which is where you identify the stakeholders and ideally engage with those stakeholders to try to identify what are their human values, what is being implicated. And you want to identify both direct and indirect stakeholders, which is why I really like value sensitive design, because I think a lot of design techniques usually focus on just the direct stakeholders. But when we're deploying something like an autonomous vehicle system at scale, there's going to be a lot of indirect and bystanders that are also being implicated by this technology. And then the other component is the next phase is the technical implementation. You'll prototype it. And the last phase is an analysis. So you could do quantitative or qualitative analyses. And what you're trying to do is link it back to the human values you identified in your conceptualization phase. And what that does is then close the loop on the human values throughout your design process.
I love that. It's so fascinating. You're so right that thinking about kind of company culture and how products are developed and how to kind of recenter around the human values that are embedded within these products is so important. We at the Center for Equity, Gender, and Leadership at Berkeley Haas School of Business have been looking at, what are the different roles that business leaders play in mitigating biases in AI systems. And a big part of that is thinking about what is that corporate culture, what's the tone of the top and how does that translate throughout a company? How are values kind of communicated throughout the company and how do those manifest within products and systems that companies develop? So thanks for bringing that up. Really, really fascinating. Neda or Nandita, do you want to add to thoughts around, what's needed to identify and tackle some of these biases in data sets and algorithms?
Nandita, you want to take this one or you want?
Sure, I can. We're like, who should go first?
I know.
I think we both have, we can both talk. The only thing I would add to it is that, yes, from, my personal background also in the importance of qualitative and quantitative user research, for example, prior to developing the model, such techniques, such as what Sarah talked about, and also qualitative research actually bring out the biases that are within us all, right? Because we as humans are designed with biases in our heads, right? That's how we function so efficiently in the world. So biases are all not bad, but everyone will have negative biases in them. And it is through these techniques of iterative prototyping, through doing user quality research, that we can actually determine what are the biases that might exist in a particular data set, but also to know that the system that works in Europe has different biases and values that we should apply than a system that works in US or say China, right? So there's contextual differences also that come into play of what that particular demographic or set of users or stakeholders might have benefit from, what is the right value allocation in those models, for example.
Wonderful, yeah. Oh yeah, and Neda, over to you, and maybe you can share both thoughts that you have on, what's needed to identify and tackle these biases, and then also, why does who that's developing these AI systems and managing these AI systems matter as well? So I'm gonna have you tackle both those questions or merge them if you don't mind.
Yeah, not at all. So I think they're great questions. And sometimes I think tackling that bias is indeed straightforward, as both Sarah and Anita have pointed out. When you have a data gap, first thing you want to do is look at the statistical distribution of your data for the problem that you're solving and see if there's a gap or not. And sometimes, thankfully, the laws of physics help you, right? If you're lacking like distance to object information in foggy weather, great. I have a data gap, I'm going to close that statistical distribution. Sometimes, though, it's not that straightforward for various reasons, because you're solving a problem that's more human-centric, and also because there are unconscious biases at play. So both Sarah and Neda have given examples of bias in technology. I'm going to give one too, from Deepti Mahajan from Fort Greenfield Labs, who shared at a GTC talk in previous years that there has been issues around bias in traffic flow design in cities that were designed, for example, for paid workers who will take a straight shot trip to the office, in pre-COVID days, versus unpaid workers who tend to take multiple stops on a not straight shot during the day. And those unpaid workers tend to be predominantly women still. And I think that COVID has certainly not helped that situation. So I think that those tend to be a little bit more difficult when there was unconscious bias in the design problem. And so this is, I think, how we need to think about, comprehensively eliminating bias from the equation. And I think that ties into your second question around who designs these systems, right? No one is all-knowing. No single person contains the human experience of every single other person in the world. And that's why I think it's so important for a diverse team to be building these products. So many studies show this now, but one thing I'd like to highlight is that the product is not just the final AI model that goes into a car or some other piece of technology. It's actually all the back-end AI tooling. It's the way that you collect your data, that you treat your data, because this model is going to learn from how you tooled it, both using these different labeling systems and everything else you did on the back end. And if you're sending, labeling guidelines to a team in a foreign country, that has never seen an 8-lane highway, that doesn't know the rules of the road, and you didn't design those labeling guidelines in mind for that, user of that backend system, that's going to translate into the performance of your model. That model for sure is going to be biased and suboptimal compared to thinking around these things ahead. So that's why I think it's incredibly important for developer teams, and ours certainly do this, to actively seek diversity when building both front end and back end products.
Yeah, that absolutely, just echoing that for sure. Really incredible really important to think about that, whose priorities, perspectives, lived experiences are going to be kind of embedded in the building and managing of these systems. And so incorporating diversity is so critical. There was a recent report from the Alan Turing Institute that some folks may have seen that looked at the gender gap in AI and showed that it brought up a statistic from the World Economic Forum around about 22% of folks working on AI systems are women. And this report kind of delved a little bit deeper to note that women tend to be in positions with lower status and lower pay as well. And so, we have a lot of work to do around looking at kind of, and it's not, diversity isn't just women either, of course, other identities that we need to think about in having the conversation around diversity more broadly. But such a good point and lots of work to do. And it's great that your companies are thinking about and prioritizing diversity. So Neda, one other kind of follow-up question for you. What do you think are there any kind of limitations around eliminating bias that are important to keep in mind, or thoughts you have around that?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting question. What I have noticed, for example, in certain cases where there have been recruiting tools that tended to be biased, for example, against women because they historically looked at mostly male resumes applying to the tech field versus women. When they try to tackle that bias, it's interesting to think about at what point are you, in some sense, correcting the bias versus losing kind of first principles information that's allowing the model to do the task that it was designed to do. So I think that it's a really, really complex problem. In some sense, knowing where the bias separates from kind of first principles feature design, and knowing how unconscious bias plays into this equation. And so I think that the first is probably a technical feature analysis issue that we really have to nail for each specific problem. And then I think the second aspect underscores a little even further the importance of having different people with different lived experiences look at this problem, because typically it's going to be someone who is underrepresented that notices things that are not quite right or are biased, because it might not occur to somebody who's never had that lived experience. So I would say that there's both a technical strategy there and a human-centric strategy.
Absolutely. Yeah, I love the combination for sure. It's not just a technical issue with technical solutions. It's broader human issue, and how can we think about it more holistically. I think that ties into the points that everyone's been making as well. And so I'm curious, with a couple minutes left here, what recommendations might each of you have for listeners who are interested in mitigating bias in AI systems in their own organizations? And maybe, Neda, we can just start with you, since you just were kind of sharing some of those thoughts, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'd like to echo what Sarah and Neda also said, that this is really a company culture. It has to come from the top, and that's the case with us. We have a committee that tracks issues related to AI regulation, bias, and ethics. And I'm going to share just a couple of concrete techniques that we've deployed. We've added language to literally documentation of our software development kits that encourages people to consider the potential for algorithmic bias in the model that they choose to use. And then we host a lot of conversations around bias even at our events. For example, the GPU Technology Conference on responsible and ethical AI. And then on top of that, we are also participating in a lot of standardization bodies that are looking to publish regulatory frameworks around AI, whether it's European Commission's, IEEE, ISO standards. So I would recommend all of those as useful ways that an organization can show commitment to eliminating bias in AI.
I love that. Yeah, there's such, clear corporate management and leadership focus, which I think is, what's really needed for sure, is that kind of longer, or that larger perspective around like AI governance, the committee that's looking at AI and thinking about engaging within regulation for ethical and responsible AI, So that's really fantastic to hear about. And I love the focus around continuing the conversation on these topics, right? And increasing awareness and continuing to think about kind of strategies and how to expand them more broadly. So that's fantastic. Maybe Sarah, over to you.
Yeah, so I guess a recommendation, the recommendation I was going to give was value sensitive design, but I already went into that. So maybe I can go into that a little bit more. In particular, I think bias actually manifests in terms of the human values, such as like fairness and reciprocity. And so I think by us better understanding what fairness and reciprocity means for us as a company, as us as a society, will allow us to continue to focus and improve what bias looks like in these technologies and how it will manifest. Because we can, put in our best effort now, but what is likely, what we consider to be biased now may not be the same what we consider to be biased in the future. And so, making sure that we have processes in place that can adapt not only to the short term, but also to the long term.
Such a good point. Yeah, the conversation around bias is so closely linked to, what is fair, and there's multiple definitions of fairness across different disciplines. And so, saying something will be fair it can be actually kind of vague. And so that's a really important point to think about. So thank you so much. And Nandita, over to you.
Yeah, I think just to give an example of the fairness, age bias does exist in the insurance and automotive industry quite a bit, but we think it's okay, right? Like it's okay for the 16-year-old to get a high insurance. So it's all very complex problem where your fairness definitions can vary. It's a complex problem that, like both Neda and Sarah have said. And I would like to just echo that it's a continuous improvement, continuous process type of, that's the main characteristics of this. User experience and human-centered also, first people had just a check mark of, yes, we did the user experience or HMI check and now it's done. The same needs to be applied in this area where it's not a check that you do in the middle of your process or your model is defined certain way check. It's a continuous process in the company, in education, and also as you build your models and test your models in the real world.
Ongoing commitment, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really critical point. With the last 2 minutes here, the last question I want to ask to you all is, we've been talking about kind of bias in AI systems in the automotive industry. How might autonomous vehicles also create other positive shifts in our society? So what are some, might they impact kind of other social norms and structural inequalities, and how can tech and business leaders today help ensure these technologies are accessible to different communities and identities to help level the playing field for tomorrow? I know it's kind of a loaded question with the last minute here, but does one of you want to jump in with a thought?
I would say that I think the most compelling thing about autonomous vehicles is the potential to save lives, just to revolutionize this whole situation where we have still around 40,000 people just in the US alone per year, getting in fatal car accidents. And so that, and also making transportation accessible to everybody. Those are the two ways that I think I'm personally passionate about, having a positive social impact.
Absolutely. So very, very exciting. Nandita or Sarah, any final words from either of you? Nandita, I see you're unmuted.
I think, like Neda said, the impact on safety is we're just scratching the surface on how we can improve driver safety. And AI is going to play a crucial role in in-cabin sensing and improvement of monitoring and making sure the systems are able to comprehend what our intentions are and our states are. So huge impact from a safety perspective that I look forward to.
Absolutely.
And I will also just echo Neda and Nandita about the safety and accessibility, especially for autonomous vehicles. And yeah, I'm really excited about the future. The AI right now is a very immature technology, but I think as long as we stay focused on the human values we want to explicitly capture in this new technology as we improve it and better understand it and robustify it, then the more likely that these technologies will achieve things like safety and accessibility.
Fantastic. Well, thank you to our incredible speakers, to each of you. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I, for one, really appreciate your leadership in this space and look forward to where it will and we will go next. I will pass it back to our wonderful host. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing both the technical and the human impacts in engineering and AI and ethics. So wonderful, wonderful panel.